And it's recording. And I will share the screen. Great. Now I will align all my windows.
I know, I was going to ask you about, so you can't see speaker notes when you're presenting in Zoom, can you?
No, I've been keeping two windows open. So I have the slides in one tab and then the notes in the other. So that's why sometimes I'm like delayed going back and forth.
No, that's what I've been doing too.
Confused.
But I just, it seems seamless from this side.
Oh, good. I'm glad it totally appears that way. So hi, everyone who's joining. Maybe as you join, as we tend to do, just shout out where you're joining from. We'd love to know where people are located in the world. Sweet. Okay, yeah. Toronto, Chicago, London. Hi, Thais. France, UK, Milwaukee. Oh my God, it's going so fast. Nebraska, Bangalore, Singapore, London, Serbia. So cool. This is my favorite part of our reading group. Seeing where everybody's coming from. It's great. All right. So I think we are going to get started. Ho Chunk Lands. Thanks, Caroline.
Oh my goodness, I'm on my laptop today. I'm going to pop out the chat so I can see it at the same time. Can I do that? Pop out, yes. Hello, chat.
Super. So hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you again for, this is week 6 of the Data Feminism Reading Group. And we're talking about chapter 5. When Lauren originally proposed the idea of doing this, I was like, I don't know if people are going to come back week over week, and people are still coming back, so that's really heartening. I was kind of imagining, you know, the curve would end up like this, and there'd be like 3 of us at the end, you know, one like really dedicated grad student would be there. But so I'm really glad to see that people are still coming and the conversation is still going. So it's super exciting for us. So without further ado, we want to just acknowledge where we are in the world. And so in exploring and writing about the imagined foundations of a society and a culture, we feel it necessary to acknowledge the very real foundation of our own. We therefore acknowledge the indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land where this event is taking place, and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land that we're on today is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation and the Muskogee Creek people. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather and perform from time immemorial. So welcome to everyone from all of your very diverse and wonderful and global locations. Oh, look. Yay. Okay, thank you, Savannah. Muskogee Creek calling here in Indian Territory. Excellent. So just similar logistical info to other weeks. Just if you remember, the way that we'll address questions after we do the presentation is in the Q&A. So feel free to post and chat and do whatever you want to in the chat. But when we look to try to raise up questions that we'll be discussing at the end, we're going to look at the Q&A. So try to look at questions there. And if you like a question, vote it up so there's a bigger chance that we'll answer it. As before, the reading group has a Google Doc, so you can check in there. At Beta Live, set up a Data Feminism reading group list on Twitter, so you can get added there if you want to be added to the list. My 11-year-old son has been doing a really great job with improving our closed captions. So we
Hopefully
do.
he's becoming radicalized in the
Well,
same time.
see, this is my secret plan. So, I want to note that he's not unpaid child labor. I'm actually paying him minimum wage for his work, and he's doing it ostensibly to get to buy Magic cards. So he loves this, card game, Magic the Gathering. It's like his obsession. But yeah, in the process, he's getting exposed to all this really amazing content. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes in the process. So, and then, as in prior weeks, thanks so much to Elvia Vasconcelos for her sketch notes. She's coming every week, and every week is producing these awesome sketch notes that we're publishing on the webpage where we're publishing the videos, so you can check those out. And my background today is from Egon Schiele, the artist from the 20th century artist. Lauren's background is courtesy of her parents' house.
I know. Guys, I've switched locations for the first time in 3 months. There's now childcare, sort of.
Yeah, but I feel like they should send in like Loie or Aurora for like a like cameo appearance or something.
Oh, I don't. I'm guessing you're going to meet the whole family. Now you get bonus generation or
yeah, 3 generations. We got the grandparents coming. Great. And speaking of childcare, my nanny is actually calling me right now, and I'm going to try to have my husband handle that. Okay. So here's where we are at. We are at the chapter, the principle that's about embracing pluralism in data feminism. This is chapter 5. And so in today's group, we're going to be discussing a lot about process. So this is a chapter that has a lot to do with process and the actual work of doing data science, like collecting and cleaning and analyzing the data, and who does that work and how does that work get done. And the main takeaway, in case you have to leave early, is basically just that process really matters. Okay, Lauren, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Okay, so the past several principles, they were strongly grounded in feminist theory, but this one about embracing pluralism comes as much from feminist organizing and activism as it does from anything else. And it has to do with embracing pluralism, as we've said, and it's certainly influenced by people like Donna Haraway's ideas about feminist objectivity, how the best knowledge comes from bringing together multiple perspectives. We've talked about this in the past, but it draws just as much from what organizers and activists have learned from experience, which is that knowledge is created through dialogue and exchange, and that exchange ultimately results in a more complete picture of the problem at hand. And I should say also, like, maybe even more than, or not, it's not a rank order, not a zero-sum game. In addition to complete knowledge, or sort of more complete knowledge, the other thing that is motivating this chapter is the real ethical imperative to engage the actual people who are affected by any work that we do. So I'm going to pass back to Catherine.
I guess I'll call. You live in Maria right now, or?
Sorry, we might have a momentary emergency here in childcare, so I may have to step away just in just a second. So we see this idea of embracing pluralism in the example of the anti-eviction mapping project, which is depicted here. One of their maps is depicted here on the left. They're also known as the AEMP. And there's this self-described collective of housing justice activists, researchers, data nerds, artists, and oral historians. And since 2013, the AEMP has worked to quantify and organize around the housing crisis in San Francisco. So they make maps, and they actually make a lot of maps, which shown here is just one of like maybe 80 maps on their website. But they do that work in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups. And at the same time that they make maps, they also create oral histories, which is what you see depicted here in this map, which is called Narratives of Displacement and Resistance. So each blue dot that's there on the map leads to a video story from a single person or a family who's facing displacement. And so Phyllis Bowie is one of those people. whose story is featured on the map, along with this like copious amount of red dots, which are depicting where people have been displaced from their home. Okay, back to Lauren.
Okay, so in the book, we contrast the work of the AEMP with the Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton University. And the Eviction Lab's goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And so you can actually see this in the map that we have presented here. And we should say, you know, to start out, this is a really worthy goal, and it's an interesting project and a valuable one. And I teach some of the papers in my classes, but it's widely different in terms of process to the AEMP. And we think the interaction, actually the two groups spoke to each other at a certain point, and we think that the interaction that these two groups had with each other is really instructive. So the Eviction Lab, when they were starting out, they were looking for national data, and they contacted the AEMP, which had been working on this project for a long time, and asked if they would share their data. And the AEMP actually didn't say no, but they said, well, we need to talk more. So like, how are we going to make sure that the data doesn't fall into the hands of landlords, for example? You know, how might we ensure that the people who are identified aren't subjected to future harm? But instead of continuing the conversation, the Eviction Lab then sort of turned around and purchased lower quality data from a real estate data broker. And the AEMP, along with several other community-based organizations, actually ended up writing a critique of the Eviction Lab's methods, which we quote in the book, and you can probably Google and find. So I'm going to pass it back to Catherine.
So let's think about this. So the Eviction Lab process is really typical of what you might call big data for social good projects. And that's kind of going to be a theme of today's reading group, is sort of thinking about how big data for social good isn't quite enough when we think about actually doing social good. And so why is it typical of those projects? Well, first of all, it prioritizes speed of data acquisition and the size of the data over the relationship building that might happen in the process of doing that work, and also even over the quality of the data. So actually the AEMP in their critique of Eviction Lab points out that they have much sort of deeper, better quality data than what the data at the national scale are showing. The other thing about the Eviction Lab sort of way of working is that it really ends up sort of reflecting on and elevating the expertise of the people at Princeton who are doing this work. And this is mainly because like the purpose for the Eviction Lab is the product, is the comprehensiveness, is the big picture visualization that they're showing. They don't see the process as being part of the work. They want the data, right? They just want to acquire the data so then they can really start, like the real work is sort of how they're thinking about it, I would imagine. Whereas for the anti-eviction mapping project, creating an inclusive, anti-racist, and community building process is central to the work. It's like just as important as any like map or policy report that they might produce. Back to Lynn.
So just to provide a big picture view of what we've been talking about thus far. So what we can see from the AEMP is that embracing pluralism in data science means valuing these many perspectives and voices, and doing so at all stages of the process. So when do you embrace pluralism in a data-driven project? All the time, everywhere, throughout the process. So this means from inception and funding, to collection and cleaning, to analysis and communication. And then it also means attending to the ways in which data science methods and values can inadvertently suppress the voices of the people we would otherwise seek to value in the service of these ideas about like clarity and cleanliness and control. So this brings us to the larger issue of cleaning data. So we've all done it, you do it a lot, it takes a lot of time, and in many cases, it's like a necessary pre-processing step before you can begin to analyze the data that you have. But we think it's really important to stop for a minute and ask what you are losing in the process, and also what goals, and also whose goals are aligned with this idea of tidy data, and whose goals are aligned with what might otherwise be called mess. And so, you know, what gets lost in the process of cleaning data and the perspectives that might be lost. And then in sort of the opposite face of the coin is whose perspectives are imposed. These are actually really serious questions, and they have a really sort of long and odious historical legacy. So, we say here like stats has a bad track record, but it's actually, we've sort of alluded to this in previous weeks. But we think, we thought it was important to stop for a minute and really be explicit about what we mean by this. So many of the men often cited as the earliest statistical luminaries, so people like Carl Pearson, Ketley, Francis Galton, Ronald Fisher. These were also leaders in the eugenics movement. So eugenics, right, is the view that humans should control the evolution of their species by encouraging the reproduction of certain kinds of people, so namely white ones, and then discouraging the reproduction of all others, where discouraging actually means things like forced sterilization or even death. And you can make these connections and people could say, well, this is true, is this true or not? But in point of fact, Carl Pearson, the name of the chair that he held at the University of London was the eugenics chair. That was the name of his position. And many of his statistical methods were designed with the idea of population control in mind. And so the point here is not that anyone who employs statistical methods right now or even cleans their data is perpetuating eugenics, but rather that the starting premise that data should always be clean and orderly, and that your analysis can only be based on this sort of neat and tidy set of data has this very specific and sort of hurtful and harmful historical legacy.
And so then we kind of make an analogy here with cleaning and tidying data to cleaning and tidying the landscape. So in the book, we tell a story about taming the landscape in the similar way that we work to clean and tidy and sort of tame our data sets to make them legible. And here we point to the work of geographer Reuben Rose Redwood. And so he describes how, if we just take the object of street signs as a kind of example, those of us who live in places with street signs kind of take them as this very given thing, they've always existed, they've always been there. But actually he does the kind of historical analysis of streets and addresses and discusses how prior to the Revolutionary War, for example, in Manhattan, there were basically no street signs. There were no signs of any kind. So if there were even names, they were more vernacular, oh, after the red house, turn left, or at the big, crook in the woods, do this. But then with the increased mobility of people and of things, if we think the rise of the postal system, the railroads, the telegraph, street names needed to become systematized. So now we have street names, we have street signs, we have address numbers, speaking at least in the US context. And Rose Redwood calls this the production of legible urban spaces, and he connects this to the rise of capitalism. But the point here is who needs street signs and who needs these street names? Because if you're a local person, you don't need street signs and street names. You live there, right? You know the people around there, and you know where all the people are located. When we have street names and street signs, when we start taming things in that way, these are for the strangers who come in. These are for the delivery people who are bringing Amazon packages to our doors, or the postal workers, or the tourists, or the business people. And so likewise, we're kind of making an analogy here to data and data sets. So data don't need cleaning and analyzing until there are strangers in the data sets, until there's this distance between who created the data and who collected the data. So who are the strangers in the data sets? In most cases, we are the strangers in the data sets. When we look at data, like a spreadsheet or something like that, it was typically collected by somebody else from a different space than we're currently physically occupying. Often the data, if they're about people, they are about a different community or group than we ourselves sort of occupy in terms of social space. They were often created to serve a purpose that is not our purpose for using the data. So if we think about working with open city government data, that was collected for a government bureaucratic purpose, and maybe we're trying to use it to do kind of a transportation analysis or something like that. So we are strangers in the data set, and the data are strange to us. And so one of the main ideas of embracing pluralism is to thinking about acknowledging the distance between ourselves and this original context of the data, to acknowledge the basic idea that data is a reduction and an abstraction of the world, and then to think about how do we connect back to local, indigenous, intimate, and proximate points of view that come from being situated in the actual place of the data. And so here I'll pass it back to Lauren.
Great. So Yanni Loukissas, who is a designer and information studies scholar and actually a former colleague of mine at Georgia Tech, has a really great phrase for the kinds of things that get lost when we find ourselves being strangers in the data set. He talks about the context surrounding the data set as the data setting, which contains all sorts of valuable information. So in his book, he tells the story. It's actually a sort of technical story, but it's I think it's pretty illustrative of the kinds of thing he's talking about. He tells the story of being at a hackathon in Cambridge, near MIT, where Catherine is, and the team that he was working with began to explore a data set from Clemson in South Carolina. And he came across this sort of unusual record where the librarian had noted the location of the item as being upstate. And so for South Carolinians, upstate is a very clear term that refers to sort of the westernmost region of the state where Clemson is located. But it doesn't hold the same meaning for, for instance, like I'm from New York and upstate means the northern, upstate New York means upstate New York, the northern region. Nor does it have a meaning for someone in Massachusetts where like there isn't an upstate part of that state. So you could choose to, look at this record and say, we want this to, play nicely with the other geographic tags that we have in our other collections. And you could convert this to the list of the 10 or so counties that qualify as upstate in South Carolina, which would make it more sort of geographically legible to more people, but you'd lose that local perspective. You'd also lose the fact that the person who created that original record was clearly from South Carolina and themselves like lived in that particular place. So I'm gonna pass back to Catherine.
And so this idea of connecting to this kind of local, experiential, indigenous knowledge, valuing that knowledge, this is kind of a hard struggle because we are precisely sort of inundated with images of like who and what data scientists are every day. So it's hard to try to build this very participatory, collaborative process around data when the people who work with data are always being sort of venerated as individual geniuses of various kinds. And so here we actually went so far as to make our own little chart about how people who work with data in things like job ads and in news articles about data scientists are alternately called unicorns because they're rare and have special skills, wizards because they can supposedly do magic, ninjas because they execute complicated expert moves, rock stars because they outperform other people, and janitors because they clean messy data. And so if you kind of just look at those as a whole, most of those metaphors are coded as solo and masculine sort of endeavors. They also carry racist and classist connotations as well. And so I think it's hard to embrace pluralism in data science, or maybe one of the reasons that we don't do this all that much, is because the world is telling us the value of the data scientist comes from being this solo individual technical genius that knows everything already and solves all the problems by themselves. So the question is sort of what do we do about this? Like how do we push back? How do we move on? How do we engage with this and really try to embrace pluralism? And so, we suggest a couple of different pathways here. So first, we can acknowledge this fairly tainted history of statistics rather than denying it or just kind of pretending like it doesn't exist. Next, we can be reflexive about both our own methods as well as our own identities and the standpoints from which where are we situated in relationship to the data? How much, sort of think about how much are we strangers in that data set and why are we strangers? Third, we can design from the margins, which we'll talk about more. And then fourth, we can deliberately shift the frame from a kind of generic data for good sort of conception to a much more specific data for co-liberation framework. And we're going to talk about that here. So the first thing I'm thinking about is this idea of reflexivity and transparency. So thinking about how do we push back on the solo geniuses, the wizards and the unicorns and so on. The first idea is thinking about how do we value both transparency and reflexivity. So increasingly in data science and in data journalism, and also in policy reports, you see this show up in a number of places, is towards disclosure of what were your methods and reproducibility of your research. So you might do a data-driven investigation, then you publish a very detailed explanation of your methods with the idea that if somebody comes in and wants to reproduce the findings, they can actually do that. So that's increasingly becoming the norm, both in sort of scientific papers and in journalistic work. So that kind of methodological transparency is great, right? And that is definitely a step towards revealing how did you arrive at a certain conclusion. But then we think it could go further into reflexivity. So not only transparency, but also reflexivity, which what does this mean? So being reflexive is this idea that you're able to both reflect on your own position within the matrix of domination, meaning like kind of where do I sit in terms of my gender identity, race identity, class identity, religion, geography, and so on. Where do I sit within these multiple intersecting dimensions of the matrix of domination? And how do I take responsibility for those positions? How do I kind of own those positions and work sort of against, like say we're talking about race, how do I work against white privilege? Or how do I leverage white privilege strategically towards anti-racist action? So meaning we think that data science teams could go further to reflect on their own identities and positionalities and be transparent about what those are. And there's a kind of visual analog to that, to sort of embodying that kind of reflexivity in data science that we see in the citizen science work of Public Lab, which is featured here. So they hang cameras from balloons and fly them sort of fairly high, a couple hundred feet up in the air in order to monitor pollution, particularly in bodies of water. And you can see here, this is from the Gowanus Canal in New York City. And then one of the side effects though of doing it like this is that the people who are doing the measuring are visible in the final product. So this is the image, one of the images that they would then use to analyze. And here we see the bodies of the mappers who are right here in the photo. So sort of thinking about how do we put ourselves back into the products. And so now I'll pass back to Lauren.
Okay. So thinking about embracing pluralism also brings up this question of like, okay, well, like, sure, embrace pluralism, but who exactly are we talking about? So not everyone obviously can participate at all times unless you had sort of an infinitely enormous budget. And the feminist response to this question is actually to center the voices of people who come from the margins. And this is actually a pretty old feminist principle, which comes from the feminist philosopher Sandra Harding's idea of standpoint theory, the idea that we can learn most from the people who occupy the most marginalized standpoints in any particular situation. As she frames it, it's the folks on the margins who actually have an advantage when evaluating sort of mainstream society because they can see what hasn't been addressed or what only works for people in the middle. And so it's like there's sort of a feminist fight between Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway. But one of the really interesting things is that this whole idea was sort of shifted over to the field of design through the work of Xiaowen Bardzell. And she has a paper introducing feminist human-computer interaction. And she proposed the idea of the, quote, marginalized user. This is like an incredibly widely cited paper in HCI fields. And so, you know, this was at this point, I don't know what the year on that paper was. Is it like early 2000s, Catherine?
2010. So it's not even that old, it's only 10 years old, yeah.
In any case, so since then, you know, there's been follow-up work about designing for the margins that argues that designers and engineers shouldn't only be engaging with people at the margins, but also actively working to dismantle the sort of center margins distinction in the first place. And then we see even more recently, people like the Design Justice Network, which has transformed this idea into one of its design principles. You can see this at the bottom of the slide. quote, "We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process." And we should say also this resonates a lot with the longstanding disability justice slogan, "Nothing about us without us." There's like a rich body of sort of practice surrounding work like this. Okay, back to Catherine.
So this leads to maybe one of the larger takeaways from this chapter about pluralism, which is a consistent and persistent emphasis on co-liberation, which we introduced actually in chapter 1, I believe, or maybe in chapter 2, but we kind of delve into it a little bit more in this chapter. So what is co-liberation? It's epitomized by this quote from Aboriginal activists in Queensland, Australia in the 1970s. And so they say, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And so in relation to data science, co-liberation is the belief that oppressive systems harm all of us. So they undermine the quality and the validity of our work, and they prevent us from creating meaningful and lasting social impact with data science. And so one of the favorite things for me about this quote is the way in which it positions the terms of the collaboration, which are really different positioning from like a data for good or tech for good frame. Because often what the data for good kind of implicitly means is that the people with like rich people, the people with a lot of stuff help the quote unquote poor people, and then they feel good about themselves and turn it into PR. Instead, what this focuses on is how folks in dominant groups, the folks with plenty, quote unquote, are also harmed by unequal systems. And another great way of explaining this comes from Detroit-based poet and community organizer named Tawana Petty. And so she explains in relationship to anti-racism efforts in the US, and this is a quote, "We need whites to firmly believe that their liberation, their humanity, is also dependent upon the destruction of racism and the dismantling of white supremacy." And that's the end of the quote. And so then in relationship to sexism, this means sexism and male supremacy also harms men, in addition to women and trans and non-binary folks. And so it's only through dismantling these systems together that we can work towards our collective freedom. And so what does this look like in data science practice? And so, you know, we try to come back to, you know, sort of examples. Where are examples of this emerging? And they are emerging, they do exist. So one example is the work of Rahul and Emily Barkov. They collectively go by the name of Data Therapy. Their work, they work with community-based organizations to create data murals. As you can see one of those murals here at the bottom of the slide. These are basically large-scale infographics that are both designed by and tell stories about the people who live and work in these spaces. And so their work involves scaffolding a data literacy process within a community-based organization that comes to them. They don't seek them out or like sell their services. The community comes to them and says, we want to do this thing. They help the organization work with their own data to analyze it and understand it in order to tell a data-driven story about themselves to a larger public. So in the case of this particular project that's here, they worked in partnership with Groundwork Somerville, which is this local organization that works on food security, and in particular with their youth program. And so they worked with the youth to try to analyze the organization's data and then depict the work that they do to grow food and feed the community. And so, you know, one like kind of point we want to bring up here is, and I think we alluded to this maybe in the introductory reading group. This was one of the examples in the book that got this interesting reviewer comment that was like, this is a nice feel-good project, but I don't see how it relates to data science. Like basically, this is not data science and you should probably take this out. And so I think it's really worth actually considering, like, why did a reviewer look at a project like this and say this does not count as data science? So like, is it because the data were not big enough? Like it was working with one organization's data? Is it because the methods that the youth were using to analyze the data were not sophisticated enough somehow? Like they were basically just doing counting and like, you know, percentages and stuff like that. So that was it that? Was it because the output was a mural? So it didn't look like a fancy chart? Was it all of those things? But I think it's really interesting that like they were kind of pushing us to exclude that. And instead, I think what we want to do is double down and say for us, for data feminism, this is data science. Like this is data science done by youth and a local nonprofit organization in collaboration with sort of experts who are helping walk them through a process. But they're walking them through they're facilitating a participatory knowledge-making process. And so this is a data science. This is what a data science looks like that values participatory process and relationship building at least as much as the final product of the knowledge-making. Okay, back to Lauren.
So in the book, we provide this nice table, which summarizes the main features of data for co-liberation. So we should just be clear that this is sort of an aspirational framework, but it sets out the considerations for aspects of a participatory data science that are not regularly addressed in collaborations between data scientists and communities, which tend to be framed more paternalistically and then sort of become PR stories for the university or the corporation that's undertaking them. So I don't know how large this is for you on your screens. So I'll just quickly read it. So data for co-liberation involves 1, leadership by members of minoritized groups working in the community. 2, money and resources managed by members of those minoritized groups. 3, data owned and governed by the community. 4, quantitative data analysis always ground truth through a participatory and community-centered data analysis project. 5, crucially, data scientists are not rock stars and wizards, but rather facilitators and guides. 6, data education and knowledge transfer are part of the project design, not sort of incidental, but built in. And then finally, building social infrastructure, by which we mean community solidarity and shared understanding, is also part of the project design. So this brings me to my favorite footnote for this chapter, which has to do with this idea of data ownership. And we're going to talk a lot more about open data next week when we talk about context. But one of the things that many of us take for granted is that even if the data are owned by the community, they should still be shared and made public, that this is sort of like a universal and unequivocal good. But many indigenous communities, in those communities, knowledge about that community and knowledge about their own cultural heritage, including data about that cultural heritage, is considered sacred knowledge. And so the footnote that you see cites a couple of projects like this one. This is just one of the ones that we cite there, Mukatu, and it's designed with this understanding of sacred knowledge in mind. So in this case, it's a content management system, sort of like WordPress or something like that, but it provides very fine-grained privacy controls that are tied to individual and groups of users. So once you upload a digital image of that object and give it some metadata, you can actually choose exactly who and crucially when individuals and groups and parts of the community get to see it.
Great. So we're talking a lot in this chapter about the importance of participation, about the importance of prioritizing, kind of local, indigenous knowledges, prioritizing the people who are close to and have intimacy with the issues at hand. And so you might say, okay, that's all great, but does it mean that all of our sort of knowledge making has to stay very local, kind of like very finely grained, located in one place or one community? Like, does it scale, basically, in Silicon Valley parlance? But the short answer is that I think that it is possible. We can value local knowledge and still ask global questions. But the way that embracing pluralism scales is through relationships. And that's like really crucial. It's through relationships of trust and coalition building. And that's similar to how anti-eviction mapping project works, rather than through quick scraping and purchasing of data, which is how the Eviction Lab project works, right? So it scales differently. You have to use a different process to scale. And so here at the end of the chapter, we give the example of the Environmental Justice Atlas. So this is a global scale research project and an open archive co-founded by scholars Leah Temper and Joan Martinez Alier. And so it's been around since 2012. It's originated in Spain. And what it's logging and mapping, it's a database of global ecological conflicts. So places where folks, have come out against something going on in terms of environmental devastation or extraction. And part of the reason that these folks created this is because environmental justice scholars were getting critiqued that they were always only focusing on these very hyper-local case studies at the expense of making connections amongst other places. So like kind of, what's going on in mining in Chile might have a lot of relevance for a place in like a wholly other continent, but folks weren't necessarily drawing those connections. But then the way that they scaled this was the researchers built the atlas by drawing on past relationships with existing organizations who are kind of themselves already on the front lines, working with indigenous communities, working with activists, working with civil society organizations. And so these are organizations that have local knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And then the atlas enables them to connect with others, build those connections, and also facilitates researchers studying questions or studying conflicts in a more quantitative and comparative context. But crucially, without sacrificing a commitment to the pluralistic process and to the dignity of local and community-based knowledges. And so this leads me to my favorite footnote. Last thing before we kind of end up here. This footnote points out kind of a false binary alert. And so it's like, I think it's just very important as we go along to remember that feminist methods do always value local and indigenous and situated knowledge, but valuing those things is not incompatible per se with quantification or quantitative methods. And so we want to be careful not to say like feminism is only qualitative and other stuff is quantitative or whatever. Because of course that prevents us from asking large scale, global scale, structural questions, which are also very important feminist questions to ask. And so the footnote says, and it's highlighting work by Ambika Tandon, this great report that I would encourage folks to read, Feminist Methodology and Technology Research. And so here we're trying to make this point that there is this whole tradition of feminist empiricism, and Tandon helpfully summarizes it by saying feminist empiricism is cognizant of the multiplicity of local knowledges, as well as their unequal translation and exchange with dominant knowledge. And it then looks at the translatability of knowledge between different social groups and communities in the matrix of domination, with the aim of conducting and disseminating research in ways that speak to a wide range of groups. So feminist empiricism can acknowledge the value and dignity of local knowledge, but also assert that there's really strong reasons to understand phenomena at the regional, country, or global level. And then Chandra Mohanty, the famous feminist theorist, explains her arguments are not against generalization as much as they are for careful, historically specific, complex generalization. So there's a way to scale that's contextual and still grounded. Okay, Lauren.
Great. So just to sum up, so embracing pluralism means participating and encouraging in a situation in which equitable and participatory processes matter at least as much as the product. And again, sort of, we end up with these phrases like as much as this, like in a way it's saying like the process is part of the product. It also involves remembering always that we're strangers in the data set, usually. It prioritizes the voices of the people who are most marginalized in that particular context. And again, think back to sort of when we talked earlier about what it means to be marginalized or minoritized. It has to do with structures of power, right? And so that can change depending on what power configuration is operating within the context where you are and the particular issues you're interested in. We always aspire to data for co-liberation, not just sort of this generic data for good. There's an emphasis on transferring knowledge between data scientists and communities, so both ways, right? All participants have something to share. And also emphasizes building and sustaining relationships across lines of social difference. So just this week, we wanted to highlight some groups in our feminist shout out that are embracing pluralism in data science. So on the right, we have a really excellent report that outlines principles for cities to work for equitable open data. It was produced by the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition and the Detroit Community Technology Project. And it comes out of several years of community-based participatory research. And then on the left, we wanted to do a shout out to the US-based research project called Our Data Bodies, or ODB. They did interviews, workshops, community organizing, all of these things in marginalized neighborhoods in 3 cities as a way of starting conversations around digital data collection and human rights, grounded in the perspectives of low-income people and communities of color. And then from their work, they produced this digital defense playbook, which you can see along with a number of other things, which we encourage you to check out. And I think, especially in this age of COVID, when COVID tracking apps are probably going to become some part of our reality, the work of groups like Our Data Bodies is just going to be so important as we move forward with that. Okay, so I think that's all for now. 12:45. We're getting
better.
We're getting good. Okay, great. So we're going to switch over to the Q&A section. And yeah, so just remember, if there's a question that you'd like us to answer, type it into that Q&A section. And if there's one that you would like us to answer, you can upvote it. And we'll just start at the top.
Yeah, so the first question is from Brooke Hawkins. They say, what institutional and individual changes, i.e. at university and researcher level, could be made to reprioritize relationship building within the research process? Which is, okay, I'll go first, Lauren, and then jump in. But yeah, I feel like this is a super crucial thing, and mainly because, again, like process is not seen or evaluated in the same way that products are typically. And so I feel like if we need to make these changes, we also need to make the case that the process matters and tie some of our evaluation to that. And I think someone like Rachel here in the Q&A also says funder level, because I think a lot of this actually this is about creating both the time to do that kind of relationship building. And I'll tell you from experience that whatever you think it is, it's like 3 times that. So, and then, so the time, but as well as the budget, because this is often why we don't prioritize process, is because we're on some tight timeline. We're adhering to metrics of success that have been established by funders or by universities and tenure boards or whatever the case may be, or the need to turn around a really quick policy report or to produce a data journalism story. And it's that kind of urgency which almost always then trumps the relationship building side of things. And so like that's what, for folks that are able to, thinking about how do we build in both the time and the money in order to do that work well. I think that's the really big question. Like, who do you need to convince, whether it's like a funder or a chair of your department or somebody that is worthwhile, and making that like a really integral part of your methodology.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much would say the same thing that Catherine has said, but just in a slightly different context. I mean, I think one of the things that as an individual working within a large institution, I've tried to do, again, as Catherine said, like you always try to pay and get funding so that you can pay community partners for their expertise in the same way that like in an academic context, another visiting faculty member would get like a guest lecture fee for speaking, like do that exact same thing for a community partner. Just because they work for a nonprofit or because they're an individual, it doesn't mean their time is not valuable. And in many ways, their time is more valuable and less well compensated than we and our peers. And trying to make that argument of equivalence, I think, sort of up the chain, saying, oh, we already have this mechanism, or grant programs, almost always let you pay honoraria for, collaborators, academic researcher collaborators. These are also collaborators. Just in a more practical perspective, I found that incorporating community partners into classes and teaching, sort of having them come talk to your class before there's like a clear project that you want to do, or even as you're building that relationship, is sort of a low stakes way to start building these relationships and sort of learning more about what community groups are up to and what meaningful collaborations could take place. And then the other thing that I'll say that I feel like is often overlooked, which is like, it might seem like it's taking a lot of time building relationships, but the reality is that once you have them, it actually makes work in the end phase really faster because because it's like, oh, who do I know who knows about this thing? Or who can I call up who can help me answer this problem or get me connected to someone else who might be tapped into this other community? And if you have the relationship already and there's mutual trust built up, then that information will be much easier for you to access in later phases. And this is something that I feel like, again, this is like a long time frame. I've been an academic for 10 years, but I feel like it's like sort of the inadvertent relationships that I started building 10 years ago are the ones that right now enable me to move more quickly when there's information I need to know. Finally, one more thing. Georgia Tech has a program called Serve, Learn, Sustain. And I think a lot of their documentation for funding and MOUs, which we should maybe mention too as being pretty important, and course structures are available on their website. So I just recommend that people check that out. I'm going to try to find it.
Great. But yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's like, it's one of the biggest questions, is sort of like, how can we both do this at the individual level, but then I also like, Brooke, that you focused it on the institutional level as well. Because the other thing, the reality is we can work to make changes at those levels in the institutions where we are, so as to like foster better practices across the whole place. So Tara has the question, how does one reconcile the need for a common vocabulary and data standardization with embracing pluralism? I work in the natural sciences, which is based on the premise of somebody else being able to interpret and replicate your data. Reflexivity and transparency are obvious answers, but often only go so far in terms of being able to compare experiments. So I can't speak directly to natural sciences since that's not my background. The one thing that I'll say is that I actually am working on a project right now where questions of data standardization are coming in. The project it's a collaborative project and we're working on it, and it's about feminicide data, so data about gender-related killings. And there's really interesting questions. There's really interesting pushes to standardize the data so that one could be able, often the data are collected by grassroots and activist organizations, often using different definitions or contextual definitions of what constitutes a feminicide. Makes it really difficult to compare data collected by one organization in one country with data collected by another organization in another country. And yet there are standardizing bodies like one of the groups we're working with, the Latin American Initiative for Open Data, is pushing for a data standard precisely so that there's more formalization in terms of the definition and so on. So I don't really have an answer for you, but only just to say that I think these are the hard questions when it comes to kind of, embrace pluralism plus adding things like standardization. And the way that I'm starting to see it, at least for this particular domain, is around like, how do we foster a collaborative conversation about both the risks and benefits of standardization, as well as ensure like a kind of participatory process to produce the data standard so that everyone feels like their sort of local context, what matters in their local context, is like there in the standard. And so, I mean, I think that's where, again, I think we make the analogy of data being like kind of like a campfire in this chapter. So if you can think about maybe like a data standard is sort of like a campfire, like it's an opportunity for deliberation and consensus building, ideally across a wide array of stakeholders. And so really it's about how do you run an effective participatory process to generate the best picture at hand, yet still leave like space for dissent, revisiting, iterations, and versions. So hopefully that's not too, oh, hey, Tim Davies. I feel like he would have a lot to say about this because he works on data standards. So hi, Tim. Tim, maybe you can put out some resources in the chat if you have any particular resources on these questions too. And Lauren, what do you think?
Well, I would just echo everything you said about the participatory process involved in building the data standard, because essentially once you have that, you can't go back. And so that part, and again, this is one of these things where, you know, rushing in the front end sort of might lead you to sort of attempt to short circuit that process, but then later on you might have to go back and be like, oh, we didn't capture this thing, or you know, we can't answer this question because way back in the beginning we didn't collect data on this, or we didn't classify it or categorize it in this particular way. So taking time up front, especially in consultation with like metadata librarians and people who are trained in information studies, people like there's people who their entire area of research is thinking about these questions around data collection. Is super important. So I would say yes to that. I mean, you know, the other thing I would say is really leading by example in the methods section of any write-up that you do, and taking the time to spell out, not just say like we cleaned and standardized it, but like say exactly how you did that process, what you removed, which processes you applied, so that you got to the point where you had the data set that you're working with. And this also applies to survey design too. You know, there's a real range of reportage on survey design in papers that we see. Some of them just say like see an appendix, and others will really sort of walk you through the rationale for the questions that they ask. And interestingly, one of the best examples of this actually comes from one of those Eviction Lab papers that I actually think was published after this whole Eviction Lab AEMP sort of conversation, where they actually have, and I'll look it up later, but they have this, they based some analysis on some survey of evictions in, I believe it was in Minneapolis or something like that. And it was based on a community survey, but they spent a lot of time explaining, you know, the 10 different questions and the process by which the individuals were asked questions about whether or not they had been evicted, and sort of why, if they said no to like, were you evicted, you need to sort of ask it a second way, and then say, well, if they have the second way, it branches off, and then you were either asked question A or question B. And so doing that more to sort of explain how you arrived at a binary data, like were you evicted or not, through this complex methodology. Again, you know, oftentimes we're all pressed for time and space in a short paper, but taking the time to say this really matters. Again, because I think this allows people to both replicate and build on your work better because they have more information to understand the context that your data is coming from. Finally, just in our chapter on labor, we'll talk a little bit more about data provenance. And Catherine and I both think there's a lot more work that could be done in sort of documenting and maybe even visualizing some of the steps that go into sort of before the data analysis phase.
Great. So maybe we have time for one more question. And the one here at the top is from Lauren Cagle. They say, the process of relationship building can be, or possibly should be, lengthy, and often doesn't yield outcomes on a predictable timeline. Do you have advice about how to engage emotionally with different stakeholders, such as activists, funders, participants, who have different expectations about how messy the process should be and how predictable outcomes should be? Yeah, I just want to like validate that. that's totally real. Really building relationships, building trust is messy, and it's not predictable, and it's really hard to like put it in a nice little timeline for the funder. And it just, this question is also making me think of this wonderful thesis, a master's student who was doing a community engaged project, and the level of uncertainty for him was really challenging to deal with because he kept going around to these different community organizations and asking for either their time or for just their feedback on what he was doing. And it was very frustrating for him that he wasn't able to know when there might be a productive relationship established. And also because, again, he's on a timeline, like he's on a very specific academic timeline, and one has to like turn in one's thesis at a specific point. And so my recommendation here for folks that want to do this work is to try to decouple, especially that initial phase of relationship building, from any kind of time deliverable things. Like I actually think like that would be your best recipe for success would be to do some of that work. I mean, ideally you could get that work funded, but when you have these external deadlines, like you have to submit the thing at this particular time, or the grant has the product due, or the tenure case has to be made, you are putting a relationship like you're endangering a relationship that isn't fully formed yet, and you're putting it in the service of this external outcome that matters a lot for you. It probably doesn't really matter for whoever the community group is. And so to the extent that you can decouple those things, it allows for the time and space to be like, okay, and like sometimes you take a breather, or like I have a person who I'm in contact with who I hope to one day collaborate with, and we touch base on email like maybe once every 3 months. Like one day I really want to do a project with her. But like I think that relationship might take like 5 years to get there, you know? So kind of seeing how you can like not immediately put those in service of output and product, basically, would be my advice. And yeah, Lauren, I don't know if you have any.
Well, I'll just chime in just to say that the book Design Justice by Sasha Cosenza-Chock, which I think I posted a link to in the chat a little bit earlier today. In one of the middle chapters has, in my opinion, like it's just such a valuable set of guidelines for exactly this type of really difficult sort of way of attempting to reconcile academic and corporate and institutional timeframes with community-based processes. And they're both principles, and then what I really appreciate is they talk a lot about sort of what happens or how you handle the fact that you are on one timeline and the group that you're working with or the set of people you're working with is on another. And I would just really recommend that. And I believe that you can buy the book right now, but the chapters are being posted one by one each week or month on the MIT Press website. And this one is a middle one. So if you can't wait, buy the book, but if you can, it will show up pretty soon for your reading and edification.
Great. All right. I think that's it for today. So yeah, thanks everyone for hanging in there, for coming back. And we will see you next Friday at noon Eastern time for talking about context, one of the most crucial parts of any kind of feminist data project. So thanks, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.